Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called The Sleepers, written by GIJoeVibin. They were hammering on the casket now. Captain Downatrox could not see them, but he knew exactly what was filling their faces. Terror. Hibernation protocol active, dispensing medicine in 10, 9, 8. The casket's computer announced in a calming voice that really didn't fit the situation. On the small screen in front of his lower pair of eyes, Downatrox saw a small message informing him that Deck 6 had now flooded completely. He was sure the water would be rising around the ankles of the men outside his casket. It was horrible, but it was all he could do. Their ship was sinking. They could do no other thing. Their engines had been ruined by a unlucky human warship. The kind that sailed, not flew. That had fired everything it had into them. They hadn't even been able to make it to their destination, instead crash landing in a mid-ocean, thankfully relatively intact. But when you were a spaceship sinking into a rather deep ocean, you either let the water in, or you were crushed by the water. Escape pods had gotten a few of the crew out, but most of the passengers, the troops he was bringing to bear on the horrible little island these humans called Britain, they were stuck in here. Those who had chemical hibernation pods entered them. Those who did not were currently outside his casket. 3, 2, 1. The icy cold medicine began pouring into his veins. Then not too long, he would fall asleep into a hibernation so deep that he could subsist for a long time on a fraction of energy. It was normally meant to reduce resource usage during long trips in hyperspace, and Downatrox didn't quite know how well it would cope with a long time submerged in water. But all the other options meant certain death. The Imperium was too busy subjugating these primitives to come and rescue several thousand of its soldiers in the middle of the ocean. The humans were also even busier. The Imperium had the technology to rescue them from the depths. It would come once the war was over. All he had to do was wait. The effects of the chemical cocktail was now overwhelming Downatrox. The screen, sensing the occupant was slipping away, switched off, but before it did, it informed him that Deck 7 had now flooded. The pounding stopped. Downatrox couldn't tell if that was the drugs or... Those hang on. Emergency awakening activate for Captain Downatrox calls change in flooding levels. It took Downatrox a moment to pass the computer statement, groggy as he was. How long had he been under? A year? 2? He'd broadcast his predicted landing zone before impact. It shouldn't have taken the Imperium too long to rescue him. That was what this was, clearly. Flooding didn't drain itself at the bottom of the ocean. The screen flashed back to life, but largely devoid of information. Their time underwater had probably seen damage to the internals. Downatrox had no doubt a few of the hibernation caskets had not made it intact. There were a few things, though. The sensor on the casket reported the water levels outside, indeed, were decreasing. In fact, if he was reading it right, it wasn't even at hip height. Open casket doors. Downatrox uttered the command phrase, noting how dry his mouth felt. That feeling was replicated everywhere else. His body was subsisting on the absolute bare minimum for so long. It was an awful feeling, being awoken from hibernation, your brain muscles and organs all suddenly demanding a full supply of every vital resource it had been denied. It was hell on any body. And the reason a proper reawakening involved a steady flow of food to gradually bring a person up to normal capability. In Downatrox's case, he would be able to operate barely long enough to reach an emergency cache. The door stuttered for a few seconds before gradually opening up. Water began flowing into the confined space of the casket, but Downatrox's head was above water, and his vac suit had enough oxygen in it. He staggered out, the water arresting his movements. Even in the pitch black, he could tell it was draining at a decent rate. Every muscle screamed in agony, but Downatrox pressed on. His legs brushed against something solid, and he knew instinctively exactly what, or rather, who it was. But he put that out of his mind as best he could, carrying on and reaching an emergency station. He fumbles at it, pressing the code in. It opened, the contents automatically detecting the low levels of breathable air and activating an oxygen generator. That was welcome. Downatox, running now on a muscle memory, located the light switch, activating a small light that finally enabled him to see the state of the section of the ship. There were more bodies than he had anticipated. Never mind that. Downatox grabbed the emergency food supply, a small hose that plugged into his vac-suit's helmet. He connected it to the necessary port, putting his mouth to the small straw inside his helmet, then sucked at it, filling his stomach with that foul-tasting, nutrient-dense liquid. It was easily the most disgusting thing he had ever tasted, but it would get him back up to normal. The water was continuing to drain, lapping merely at his ankles by the time Downatox finished. He watched as it continued to drain away, a small bit of water still locked inside, unable to get past the very base of the door. That was more than enough, though. Downatox grabbed a small flare from the emergency cabinet, activating it and getting some handheld light. Then he started moving down the line of caskets that marked the rest of his crew, inspecting for any damage. There were dents and smashes in many of them, which he suspected came from those that were now just bodies on the floor. He activated the emergency reactivation systems, punching a code in for each, one by one. Those inside each casket stirred back to life, and a short while later, their doors were opening. The inhabitants were in much the same predicament as he had been earlier. Desperate hunger and exhaustion. Downatox simply directed them to the emergency supplies, heading off to try and collect more information about the state of the vessel. One problem crossed his mind. Why hadn't the Imperium sent in people by now? They had to be surfaced or the water wouldn't be draining. They should be getting swamped by Imperium troops now, providing them aid and doing the task of freeing his fellow crew from the caskets for him. Why had they not come in? Downatox pressed on to the bridge, a cramped affair like everything else on board. It was completely dry by now, only a few puddles of water visible by the light of his flare. He went to his captain's console, but it was devoid of power. The Exo's console, still nothing. How odd. The battery should have lasted for a few years. That also ruled out any chance at seeing the outside world, since, like any good spaceship, they lacked windows. "Captain, all the power is out." Exoperis, the aforementioned Exo, appeared at the door. They similarly carried a flare in the hand, raising it high for illumination. "Yes, Exo, I am aware. Do you have a head count yet?" Downatox asked, as he kept moving around the room, inspecting everything. The water had done a lot of damage, which was to be expected. But even with his limited knowledge of the seas, he felt this was far too bad for such a short span. Perhaps there was something especially wrong with this horrible planet's oceans. "More than half the crew caskets malfunctioned, sir. No idea how many of our passengers made it. But by some back-of-the-envelope maths, we should still have around 10,000 survivors." 10,000? That was a lot. Less than he would have liked. Much less, but still a lot. Downatox could for the first time pat himself on the back in a non-selfish way. He had done the right thing. "What's the plan, sir? I can't help but notice that our rescuers haven't bothered to welcome us back to service." "Give me a power source so that we can trigger the reactivation of the crew. We've probably got all the airlocks open too. So it shouldn't be too hard to go out and meet them once everyone is reactivated." "Yes, sir." Exoperis headed off, probably going to the cargo bay to get a power back from one of the tanks. If the worst came to worst, they could probably use a fusion generator intended for one of the deployable bridges. That would easily have survived and provide enough power to get the systems working. "Sir," a different voice this time, poking their head around the corner of the bridge. Downatox did not recognize them, but by the armor undersuit they wore, they were a random soldier. "What?" "Sir, you need to see this." The soldier produced a small clockwork device, showing it to Dynatrox. It looked vaguely like a sort of thing that you would see in a museum. Small hands and cogs were ticking away. "This is an heirloom timekeeper, sir. No electrics, nothing. Been going since we left Anchorage. Probably the only working chronograph on the ship. Everything else has been fried by the water." "What's your point?" Dynatrox snapped out. He had no interest in seeing the stupid soldier's little toy. "Sir, this issue is, well, it's not 100% accurate. It will have been thrown off by a few things, but, by this, we've been in hibernation for, at least 40 galactic standard years." "Oh. That can't be possibly right, sir. I'm rounding down. It could be longer, but I know this has to be the minimum." Dynatrox was floored. 40 GSY. The Imperium couldn't possibly leave them stuck down there for that long. It wouldn't dream of it. The Imperium cared for its soldiers. But, Krishmila, that would explain the damage. Perhaps the broadcast had been lost in the confusion. Perhaps the humans had taken a bit longer to subjugate than expected. That wouldn't be too surprising. The Imperium had likely just had other priorities first. Yes, of course. This did change Dynatrox's calculus, though. If he had been out for 40 GSY, then he didn't want to waste another moment in meeting his rescuers. His family would have moved on without him. There would be so many developments in galactic news to catch up on. He didn't need to sit around waiting for everyone to be activated. No, he needed to get out of here, right now. Wordlessly, Dynatrox pushed past the soldier, heading for the nearest airlock. His crews were either waking up, waking others, or attempting to effect repairs. Several appeared to be trying to manually bail the last remaining bits of water from each compartment, starting to fill helmets up with as much as they could. Seeing the commander heading for the airlock, many of them followed, presumably taking this as an approval to start dumping it out of the sides of the ship. As he got closer to the airlock, Dynatrox removed his own helmet, since clearly it was breathable at this point. He took a sniff of it, the salty air of this world's oceans filling his lungs. Before now, he only ever had been to some small lakes and rivers, never getting this close to an ocean. He somewhat liked the smell, and it certainly beat the stale air of his vac suit. Finally, Dynatrox and his impromptu entourage reached the airlock corridor. Light was pouring in, finally rendering the flare unnecessary. Dynatrox deactivated the flare, stuffing it into the pocket while he approached. The light was near blinding, and he could hear the din of something. He shielded his lower eyes, trying to let them adjust to the light. Behind him, he heard a crewman stumble, spilling their helmet full of water onto the decking. Dynatrox paused. His eyes continued to adjust as best they could. They were clearly moored alongside some sort of large platform, the airlock leading right onto what was probably a landing pad for a shuttlecraft. As Dynatrox stepped out, he glanced around, the design reminding him of a photo he had seen of a human oil rig. Presumably, this had been where the refloating effort was launched from. He looked off the platform, seeing huge objects floating in the ocean nearby. At first he couldn't tell what they were, but upon opening his upper eyes, the ones for longer-range vision, he recognized them. They're ships. Not spaceships, no. Water-going vessels, large ones, that would easily dwarf the small pleasure craft that was his sole prior experience with seagoing craft. Their designs were completely unfamiliar to him, looking like no Imperium vessel that he had ever heard of. Not like the Imperium had much use for water-going vessels, of course. But these were strange, angular designs that looked built for war on the seas, rather than the kind of material ferries that were the furthest extent of Imperium naval technology. Each of these ships had a turret, with a large main gun of some sort porting right at him. Dynatrox suspected that he could recognize the signs of missile launchers all across their hull. Aircraft were everywhere. Again, not ones that he recognized, no. These were mostly helicopters. Was that the right word? An old primitive form of shuttlecraft incapable of leaving an atmosphere or flying particularly high. The Imperium hadn't used them in centuries. Why were they here? And why did he have so many weapons on them, pointing at the ship? And furthermore, What was that blue flag painted onto the side of everything? As a flight of fighter jets passed over at low level, Trox got increasingly concerned. But as if to briefly ease his alarm, he spotted a small crowd of figures, appearing from one of the doors that led deeper in the platform. The leader was unmistakably a Hecatane, as were several others amongst the group. But there were unmistakably humans amidst them. Humans in full battle armor, with guns. In those moments, Trox's mind raced with potential excuses. They'd been gone for 40 years. The Imperium would have brought the humans to heel. These were just loyal subjects, doing their part. The flag? Well, maybe they just changed the flag in the intervening years. The boats, they could be, well, maybe High Command had reevaluated some things. The group of figures closed in. The leader raised and moved their hand in a gesture that Trox did not recognize. He suspected it was some sort of human signal.
Captain Trox, on behalf of the United Nations, I am here to welcome you back to the galaxy. You've been under the water for 45 years and 26 days.
There was an outcry of shock from the other soldiers, several of them dropping their helmets. Trox couldn't fathom it. The United Nations? That was what the humans had gone by during the war. What was this about? And why was this Hecatane serving them?
Why have you betrayed your nation? The Imperium collapsed shortly after your sinking. It is no more. Liar! One of the soldiers yelled, reflexively reaching for their pistol. I can assure you that your pistol does not work anymore. Weapons don't tend to do well after a few decades in the ocean. Besides, the Hecatane gestured around them at the armored soldiers, the warships, and the helicopters. You wouldn't get very far if you did. Now we reckon there's about 15,000 of you left in there. You are 15,000 soldiers on Earth, the most defended planet in the entire galaxy, decades behind the technological curve. Your odds are not good.
As if to accentuate the man's point, something new appeared in the distance. There was a ship, but not a sea-going vessel this time. No, this one was, well, Trox supposed it was an airship, one visibly covered in guns. It lazily advanced towards them out of the clouds, ready to add its weight to the array of firepower currently pointing at Trox.
Captain, you are a smart enough man to have saved much of your crew. You therefore know there is no choice here. Now, if you come here with me, we can bring you up to speed on just how badly your commander's fecked up. Or if it's going to insist on having a choice, we can find a different box to put you in for a few decades. Except this time you won't get to sleep through it.
End of story.
I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.